6. On physical compulsion and suppression. It is in this connection and only in this connection that one can justifiably approach the problem of the physical inducement of other people, because this kind of inducement, first of all, does not stand independently, detached from other types of inducement, but is in fact their basis and cloister. Physical force used on other people forms the last and most extreme stage of guiding compulsion. It appears when self-inducement does not work, and external mental compulsion proves to be insufficient or untenable. Of course, those whose nature is simple, rude, impetuous, unbalanced, and angry are inclined to overlook this relationship and neglect this gradation. But in principle, the following fact does not change. There are no means, no such medicines or poisons, that people could not abuse by frivolity or recklessness, and all these abuses do not discredit these means as such. Excessiveness does not come from the means, but from the immoderate user. The inappropriateness or intempestive nature of any remedy does not indicate its evil properties. Arsenic poisons, but arsenic also cures, and is it not naive to think that a talentless and incompetent surgeon, who is crazed as well, imagines that surgery is a cure-all, and thus compromises surgery as a practice? In the absence of an extreme situation, one should not amputate. But does this mean that amputation itself is evil, and that the amputating person does his work out of revenge, envy, lust for power, and anger? Is it not naive to ascribe to hydrotherapy what results from the abuse of hydrotherapy, or money as guilty of the fraudulent motives and villainies of the embezzler? And is it right, regardless of the educator's intelligence, if he teaches the child to vandalize a chair on which he hurt himself? Of course, one who has not worked past temptation finds it in his nature to blame tempting circumstances in everything, and a weak person blames all of his failures on his depressing traits which conspire against him. However, there are outcomes more worthy and prosperous in the spiritual sense. The analytical considerations set forth above guide us to an acknowledgement that the physical compulsion of man by man is not evil, and, further, that evil is not in any way reducible either to the infliction of physical suffering upon one's fellow man, or to the impact on the spirit of a person through the medium of his body. External physical influence as such is not evil only because nothing external itself can be either good or evil. It can only be a manifestation of inner good or evil. He who morally condemns the external either invents an absurdity, applying moral concepts without any sense, or, without realizing it, he condemns not the external but the internal, which, perhaps, does not deserve condemnation. So it makes sense to say that ferocious vindictiveness is evil, but it does not make sense to say that a bloody cut is evil. Similarly, it makes sense to say that hatred that brings about a poisoning is evil, but it is pointless to say that the introduction of poison into another's body is evil. However, if someone wanted to assert that every physical influence on another is evil, since it is done with deliberate intent, then this would also be untenable. Any deliberate physical influence on another is, of course, the manifestation of volitional effort and volitional action. But the effort of the will is not in itself evil, for it can directly serve the requirements of clarity and love. It can endeavor to meet their demands, it can conditionally precede and temporarily substitute for them. Will may be evil, and in such cases it turns out to be against both spirituality and love. It breaks away from its vision and from its profound, creatively nurturing power, and thus becomes blind, groundless, and destructive, transforming into a mechanism of malevolent obsession. But in other cases, it may not be evil, and then it stays true to its nature. It sees and chooses, it does not mislead, but guides. It creates and builds even when in the outward appearance it destroys something. Therefore, it is not enough to point out the intentionality of physical influence in order to condemn and reject its employment as such. In light of this, use of external physical inducement is not subject to condemnation, either by virtue of its external corporeality or by virtue of its willful intentionality. Both characteristics can be observed without an evil deed taking place. So, the strict prohibition against an unauthorized child boarding a boat bound for stormy seas, a prohibition accompanied by a threat to lock him up and, finally, responding to disobedience with the implementation of such a threat, cannot be considered a crime. Physical suppression will take place, but to condemn it as violence would mean a complete inattention to the moral essence of the act. Likewise, if my friends, seeing that I am possessed by violent anger, that I am rushing to kill and will not see reason, proceed to bind me and lock me up until the fit of rage passes, they will not have abused me, but will have gifted me with the greatest spiritual blessing, and it is natural that I will keep a sense of gratitude towards them until the end of my days. In contrast, the order of an extortioner to pay a ransom, accompanied by a threat of torturing a kidnapped child, with the outcome of non-payment being the implementation of that threat. Now that would be a real crime, and only spiritual and terminological bankruptcy can equate all these actions in the general rejection of violence as such. All of this means that the question of the moral value of external physical inducement does not depend on the external corporeality of the effect nor on the willful intentionality of the act, but on the state of the soul and spirit of the person employing physical influence. The use of physical inducement would be a manifestation of evil if by its very nature it was against spirituality and love. But in reality, it is not at all hostile to either of these things. To express this in clear terms, the person who uses discipline does not directly appeal to another's clarity and love, which are fundamentally and substantively unforced, but to his will, expressing it through the means of bodily compulsion or direct external restriction. Such compulsion and suppression cannot result from evil, cannot move a person to do evil, and cannot indicate an evil objective. So evil denies spirit and clarity, seeks to weaken them, to disintegrate and ground them, whilst on the contrary, physical compulsion and suppression, unlike evil violence, do not deny the spirit and clarity. They do not seek to weaken them, disintegrate or ground them. But instead they only appeal to the human will rather than clarity, or compel it to practice self-coercion, or stop its ability to spread its malign influence elsewhere. Similarly, evil denies love and loving unity, seeks to weaken them, to degrade and extinguish them, whilst on the contrary, physical compulsion and suppression, unlike evil violence, do not deny love and loving unity, they do not aspire to weaken them, to degrade or extinguish them, but instead only appeal to the human will rather than love, or compel it to practice self-coercion or suppress its external evil manifestations. Physical compulsion and suppression would be anti-spiritual if they believed in or sought an end to the spiritual self-education of the coerced, undermining his will or damaging his clarity, or made an effort to suppress precisely his clarity and his will. But this applies only to particular, specifically bad methods of physical pressure, which destroy the physical and mental health of the compelled, deprivation of food or sleep, compulsory backbreaking work, physical torture, forced interaction with evil men, etc. However, the anti-spirituality of the anti-spiritual methods of compulsion does not indicate the anti-spirituality of all methods of compulsion. In fact, the purpose of physical compulsion and suppression is precisely the opposite, not to loosen the will, but to encourage its efforts, not to suppress the will, but to guide its initiative in the right direction, not to damage or suppress clarity, but to prevent the outward rampage of blindness, paving the way for the discovery of the inner eye and, perhaps, for its epiphany. Physical compulsion, of course, cannot by itself bring about clarity, but, for example, the isolation of the unbridled person, forcing him to cease the external manifesting of his evil inclinations and passions, encourages him to concentrate on his internal state in which his soul can and should find favorable circumstances to burn out and be transformed. For many people, being deprived of the freedom of external fantasies is the first condition for the acquisition of inner freedom. That is, for spiritual catharsis, vision, and repentance. So, bad kinds of physical compulsion and suppression can spiritually damage the compelled, but this does not mean that every kind of constraint is evil and harmful. Likewise, physical compulsion would be contrary to love if it replaced, suppressed, or believed in the destruction of a person's ability to embrace loving unity, showing vicious hostility to the compelled or compelling him into a malicious enmity, or calling on all other people to hate the compelled or for them to hate one another. But all this applies only to particular, specifically bad methods of compulsion and suppression, which precisely by such means approach the true definition of violence and are subject to rejection: brutal, humiliating treatment of prisoners, corporal punishments, depriving them of all manifestations of love, visits, broadcasts, reading, worship, a confessor, supplying them with only misanthropic literature, etc. However, the callous, unloving nature of some compulsion is not at all indicative of the unloving nature of all compulsion. True, it happens that people, compelling others, fall into anger or become occupational chairmen of internal malignancy, jailers, executioners. But is it permissible to generalize this in the sense that everyone involved in compulsion or suppression is motivated by hate, or that their compulsion is done in the cause of mutual animosity? Is there such a profession in which people could not fall into anger and hatred? But it is precisely those who enforce the state's acts of compulsion and suppression who need not act with anger, but with impartiality, not with hatred, but with a sober and balanced mind, not with vindictiveness, but with justice. True, they do require a strong and accurate will, severity and personal courage, but are those the same things as anger and hatred? True, they must be free from a weakness for sentimentality and baseless compassion, but are those the same things as love and spiritual unity? Of course, an embittered arbiter of discipline spiritually harms the subject of that discipline, and others, and the entire state. But how do we know that everyone who suppresses evil is in fact a misanthrope? Where does this whole fable of kind, downtrodden villains and scorned, viciously hated statesmen come from? And should not we finish once and for all with this stupid and harmful bedtime story? One cannot but admit that physical compulsion and suppression is almost always unpleasant and often even mentally excruciating, and moreover not only for the compelled, but also for he who compels. But only a completely naive hedonist can consider all that is unpleasant or provokes suffering to be evil, and all that is pleasant and provokes pleasure to be good. In fact, too often it happens that evil is pleasing to people, but good is unpleasant. Yes, physical suppression deprives a person of pleasure and causes suffering, but the true educator knows that love for the educated person should not in any way be expressed by bringing him pleasures and in cautiously protecting him from suffering. On the contrary, it is in suffering, especially when given to a person in a wise way, that the soul deepens, grows stronger, and begins to truly see. And it is in the pleasures, especially when not observed wisely, that the soul surrenders to evil passions and becomes blind. Of course, a person who is roughly moved, beaten, bound, perhaps even imprisoned for a long time, experiences unpleasant, maybe agonizing hours and days. But this does not mean that he has been accosted by another's anger, that he has become a subject of hatred, and that all of this leads him to reciprocal resentment and the demise of his love. Quite to the contrary, the troubles and sufferings that he endures could be inflicted upon him by a will which wishes him good and others good, and can become for him the source of the greatest good in life. True, spiteful violence often, though not always, elicits a feeling of anger in the victim's soul, but here it is not a question of spite or violence. It is understandable that even in the case of physical suppression which is not spiteful, a feeling of anger may arise in he who has been seized. But does there exist any such act which would be secured from any reciprocal anger, and is it not the case that people on occasion respond with hatred to the goodness of the righteous? Does this mean that for fear of human malice, one should abstain from any, and even sincerely benevolent actions? Of course not, and it therefore follows that if physical compulsion is necessary, but causes the compelled to have a feeling of anger, this does not mean that one should refrain from compulsion, but it means that compulsion must first take place, and then afterwards that other, non-physical measures must be taken, so that the feeling of anger is overcome and transformed by the angry soul itself. And this is possible because compulsion is not an expression of evil, but of spiritual standards, strong-willed firmness and rigor, and such rigor, firmness, and an insistence on standards are not at all in contradiction to love. And the task of compulsion is not at all to incite enmity and hatred, but on the contrary, to suppress the mental mechanism of hatred and enmity aspiring to break free and consolidate itself with irreparable deeds. But perhaps the perversity of physical compulsion and suppression is rooted not in any malignancy on the part of the compelling spirit, but instead in the very method of human influence upon man.